The Iron Cross, and this film clearly shows the manner in which Dönitz related to his men. Awarded the Knight's Cross some months later in March 1940 for his successful command of U-48 was Herbert Schulze. During its first 4 cruises under Schulze, U-48 sank 16 ships, amounting to some 109,074 tons. His final tally was 28 vessels, and he survived the war. Hitler's decision to forestall any Anglo-French attempt to interrupt the vital shipment of iron ore to Germany through the ice-free port of Narvik in northern Norway led to a commitment of the bulk of the Kriegsmarine surface fleet to Operation Weserübung in April 1940. Denmark capitulated within 24 hours of the beginning of operations on the 9th of April, but German moves on Norway prompted a major response from the Royal Navy. Integral to the German naval plan was the involvement of all serviceable U-boats to support the surface elements. The need for submarines for the Norwegian operation led to the cancellation of U-boat operations in the Atlantic. For the period of the campaign, they were to forego attacks on ordinary shipping and concentrate on the defence of the Norwegian area and attacks on enemy warships and transports. Their subsequent performance in the intense naval operations amid the fjords were deemed by the Germans themselves to have been a failure. Post-battle analysis pointed the finger of blame not at U-boat commanders nor with their tactics, but to the inadequacy of the torpedoes, the spectacular record of failure of which now led to a crisis within the U-boat arm. Commanders described how torpedoes exploded prematurely or not at all, so that many attacks on enemy warships came to nothing. The subsequent discovery that torpedoes, whether fitted with contact or magnetic pistols, did not function properly in northern waters meant that to all intents and purposes the U-boats were without a weapon. Months would elapse before these problems were solved. The unfolding events of May and June 1940, when German ground and air forces occupied the Low Countries and vanquished the Anglo-French armies, was watched with rapt attention by the U-boat High Command. With the fall of Paris and the signing of the French surrender on June the 21st, Dönitz and his colleagues realized that the naval war had now been transformed. At one fell swoop, the strategic situation of Germany at sea had been revolutionized by the delivery into German hands of the ports along the Bay of Biscay and their direct access to the Atlantic and the vital arterial sea lanes on which Great Britain depended for her existence. In anticipation of such an outcome, U-boat Command had a train waiting and equipped with torpedoes and personnel necessary for the maintenance of U-boats, which was dispatched to the Biscay area within 24 hours of the surrender. Although the Germans were denied access to the French Navy under the terms of the surrender, its mothballing robbed the Royal Navy of many French vessels which it had been able to use in the vital task of convoy protection. Dönitz was therefore not exaggerating when he described the changed strategic situation as of the greatest possible significance to the U-boat campaign. While his leader basked in the adulation of his people during the Great Victory Parade in Berlin, Dönitz was gearing up his men for a long war, for he did not believe Britain would surrender or be invaded. In practical terms, basing submarines on the Biscay coast saved some 450 miles on the northern convoy route from Wilhelmshaven or Kiel. More important for Dönitz, however, was the time saved in the coverage of that distance. A week was saved, resulting in a raising of the number of U-boats available for the operational area in the Atlantic by as much as 25% per month. On July the 7th, Kapitän-Leutnant Fritz Lemp sailed U-30 into the port of Lorient on the southern coast of Brittany to become the first German submarine to employ the facilities of this former French naval base. This port was to become one of the primary bases from which many U-boats would sortie into the Atlantic in the months and years to come. Arriving shortly thereafter was submarine U-A, originally built for Turkey and taken over by the Kriegsmarine. At the quayside to greet both returning crews was Dönitz, who was shortly to move his U-boat headquarters from Wilhelmshaven to Lorient. He greatly approved of the facilities of the base, observing that they were superior to those of the overburdened yards in Germany. At first, the facilities were used to resupply and rearm the U-boats. G7 torpedoes, manufactured and then delivered by rail from Germany to Lorient, are being loaded onto a U-boat soon to depart on a new cruise. The primary disadvantage of Lorient and of the other bases that came online later in the year was their close proximity to England, as they were well within range of RAF bombers. Indeed, it was Hitler who first broached the subject of providing the new U-boat bases with permanent protection later in 1940, and authorized the construction of the great concrete pens that were to become so much a feature in the Biscay bases by 1943. Shortly after his arrival with U-30, Lemp was transferred to take command of the U-110, a longer-ranging Type 9B U-boat. It was while in command of this submarine that he was killed when the vessel was forced to surface by two Royal Naval destroyers when attacking convoy OB-318 off the Azores in May 1941. If for the British the second half of 1940 was to witness a major hemorrhage in shipping losses, then it was their perception that it was not just the U-boats that were responsible. Casting a great shadow over the sea lanes was the Focke-Wulf Condor, a former airliner built before the war for Deutsche Lufthansa and modified to serve as a long-range patrol aircraft over water. Although carrying a relatively small bomb load, the heavy onboard armament and long range of the machine allowed Condors to fly far out to sea, way beyond the ability of the RAF, to offer air protection to merchant ships, which subsequently became easy prey for this four-engine Predator. The very small numbers of Condors available equipped the first Staffel of Kampfgeschwader 40 based at Bordeaux, from which they began operations in June 1940. Nevertheless, the rising number of ships sunk by Condors from June onwards led Churchill to describe the aircraft as the scourge of the Atlantic. While Dönitz was pleased that these aircraft were proving so successful, the Condors nevertheless symbolized for him a fundamental problem facing his ability to direct the operations of his U-boats in the location of convoys. In clear visibility, which was somewhat rare in the North Atlantic, the smoke of merchantmen could be seen from the conning tower of a U-boat up to 50 miles away. But on most days there was a heavy swell and visibility was poor, leading to convoys slipping past. Ever since 1938, Dönitz had been pressing for the Navy to possess its own long-range reconnaissance aircraft that could be employed to work as spotters for his submarines. Hermann Goering, as head of the Luftwaffe, had set his face totally against such a proposal. Even with the introduction of the Condor over the Atlantic, Dönitz could not direct the operations of KG-40. In December, he had reported that KG-40 was independent and cooperation with the formation was only due to personal contact, and that just one Condor was available daily. When, in January 1941, Hitler sanctioned the subordination of one KG-40 to Dönitz to provide reconnaissance for U-boats, Goering tried vigorously to get him to give them up. For Goering, denying the Navy an air arm was more important than aiding the U-boat war. As it was, the Condor U-boat relationship ultimately proved a failure. It is hardly surprising that the period between June and October 1940, during which the U-boats carried out a veritable slaughter of merchant shipping en route to the United Kingdom, corresponded to that nation's moment of greatest peril. In the face of the imminent threat of invasion of the home island, virtually all air and naval assets were pulled back to lend assistance to those already tasked with opposing a German seaborne landing from across the Channel. The upshot being that shipping, whether in convoy or sailing alone, did so virtually without protection. Furthermore, other French bases such as Brest, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice and Bordeaux came on stream as U-boat bases, allowing more submarines to feed in directly to the Atlantic shipping lanes. This culmination of factors in favour of Dönitz boats became all too apparent in this period, so that it was subsequently referred to by the U-boat commanders as the first of the happy times. For the loss of 6 of their own number, the U-boat sank 275 vessels. The worst month for the British was June, where, in addition to the 58 ships sunk by submarine, a further 22 were dispatched by the Luftwaffe, a total amounting to 479,000 tons. Using Wolfpack tactics employing multiple U-boats, the submarines attacked on the surface and in darkness. On the night of the 21st of September, U-boat numbers 99, 65, 48, 46 and 43 attacked convoy HX-72 by this method and sank 11 vessels. On the 19th of October, employing these same methods, convoy HX-79 was attacked and 12 ships sunk. One Royal Navy captain observed of the U-boats how, thanks to their low silhouette, they are almost undetectable in the dark. Because of their small size, they can avoid collisions or speedily disappear under the waves if spotted by escort ships. Our ASDIC is virtually useless against this mode of attack, and we are almost powerless under such conditions. For Dönitz, such actions and such successes provided grim verification of the techniques developed since 1935 in training U-boats to attack convoys employing pack tactics. The emergence of a rash of highly successful submarine captains was exploited to the full, with their faces being splashed across the newspapers and the newsreels. Joachim Schepke, commander of U-100, who had sunk a grand total of 35 ships by March 1941 when he met his death. Wilhelm Lieber, who sank 32 ships totaling 168,000 tons as commander of U-38 through to June 1941. Best known of the Grey Wolves at this time because of his Scapa Flow exploit was Günter Prien. If June 1940 recorded the highest monthly shipping loss of the war, with 284,000 tons sunk, Prien accounted for 66,587 tons. Returning to Lorient is U-99 and the Mount of Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, the one-shot ace who was Germany's most successful U-boat commander of the war, with a final tonnage tally of 314,000 tons. He took command of U-99 in April 1940, after 9 cruises in U-23, in which he had sunk 9 vessels. In the 3 months from June 1940, Kretschmer carved out a name for himself, and when awarded the Knight's Cross on August the 4th, he'd sunk 117,000 tons of shipping. It was against this desperate backdrop of sinkings that President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act, permitting the export of large amounts of war material to Britain to aid her fight against Germany. While the USA was neutral, Roosevelt was mindful to extend to Britain all aid short of war to ensure her survival. Churchill openly admitted to the US president that he was facing a catastrophe at sea and needed to obtain additional escort vessels to protect the convoys. In a deft political move that sidestepped his critics in Congress, Roosevelt granted Churchill's request and exchanged 50 World War I 4-stacker destroyers for leased bases in British territories overseas. Although on paper the transfer of these 50 destroyers provided the Royal Navy with a vital infusion of escort vessels, in practice they left much to be desired. Renamed the Town class, these 4-funnelled vessels were to render sterling service. Capable of high speeds, they were loathed by the crews fated to serve in them. They were narrow, rolled viciously, and were difficult to handle. Nevertheless, most of them performed well, and they filled a critical gap in the Royal Navy's defences during a time of desperate need. The Sunderland flying boat, which along with the American-built Hudson patrol bomber was the only truly modern type operated by RAF Coastal Command in 1939 and was by 1941 available in far more numbers. With a maximum range of 2,900 miles, the Sunderland was the only type that could fly far out to sea over the convoy routes. It was a vital weapon in the fight against the U-boat. By 1941, it had been joined by 30 examples of the US-supplied consolidated PBY-5 Catalina flying boat. Although slower than the Sunderland, its range was greater, allowing it to stay on station and shadow convoys for long periods. When carrying depth bombs, it was used to attack U-boats. unbeknown to the Germans, the British had achieved a major intelligence coup when they retrieved a working Enigma decoding machine from Lemp's sinking U-110 in May 1941. Sent to the Special Intelligence Service station at Bletchley Park in England, the codes were broken by the end of May. Deciphered signals sent by U-boat command to their ships in the Atlantic were thus being read, in consequence of which the Admiralty rerouted convoys to avoid U-boats. A radical improvement in other measures in the first half of 1941 saw major successes against the U-boats. Increases in escort numbers, improved techniques and surface radar all came together in this period, and many U-boat aces became their victims. Shepka perished on the 17th of March when the destroyers Vanoc and Walker killed U-100 after a long pursuit, Vanoc ramming the surfaced submarine. In consequence of these more effective defensive measures by the Royal Navy, the U-boats found their areas of operations being forced further westwards and out into the Atlantic. Possibly the most famous victim of the new escort techniques was Gunter Prien. On the 6th of March, Prien attacked convoy OB-293. Denied success, he nevertheless maintained contact. On the 8th, he fired again, but was depth-bombed. U-47 never resurfaced. Prien was killed. A week later, Kretschmer was captured after U-99 was brought to the surface when attacking convoy number HX-112. He and his crew were forced to abandon ship, and he spent the rest of the war as a POW in Canada. The extensive film taken by this newsreel cameraman when part of the crew of U-46 in the Atlantic in the second half of 1941 gives us a real insight into the routine and way of life aboard a U-boat. As part of the 7th U-boat flotilla based at the Biscay port of Saint-Nazaire, U-46 was under the command of Engelbert Endras, a noted U-boat ace. At this stage of the war, it was still possible for U-boats to cross the Bay of Biscay without attack from British aircraft, although by 1942 and 1943, the chances of traversing this area of sea without attracting a roving Sunderland was increasingly problematic. Nor would the scene of one U-boat passing another, one homeward and the other outward bound, occur very often in the future. Clearly seen on the conning tower of U-46 is the charging bull emblem which Endras had adopted from Prien's U-47. Having spotted smoke on the horizon, the alarm is given and the submarine prepares to crash dive. Watch crew comes tumbling down the interior of the conning tower, with the last being Endras himself. As soon as the submarine begins to dive, crewmen move to engage the electric motors as the two diesel engines used to propel the submarine on the surface are closed down. Fed by large accumulators, the electric motors allowed the submerged craft to move underwater at a maximum speed of 7 knots. It was the fact of this low underwater speed that led to attacks on convoys, which frequently moved at a slightly faster pace, being made at night when the U-boat could travel unseen at some 17 knots on the surface. It was also this low underwater speed which permitted British escorts, which could move more quickly on the surface, to hunt down U-boats underwater once their numbers and effectiveness increased from 1941 onwards. While running just below the surface, Endras orders the periscope raised to view the location of the enemy vessel. In the absence of enemy escorts, Endras has chosen to dispatch this merchantman by gunfire. The gun crew pull out the shells for the 88mm gun, which is stored in a waterproof locker under the foredeck. Normally, the gun would be used to finish off a vessel that had first been damaged by torpedoes. This, if possible, was the preferred method, as torpedoes were valuable weapons and were to be preserved where possible. Exhaustion of the torpedo complement normally required a return to port. This was to a certain extent alleviated by supply ships and later Milch Cow supply submarines. This merchantman is itself armed and is firing back at the U-boat. The final outcome is not in doubt, and a number of hits from the 88 along the waterline of the vessel seal its fate, and it sinks to a watery grave. The two six-cylinder 1400 HP diesel engines used four-stroke oil drawn from the external hull tanks that gave the Type 7 its distinctive bulged hull. While Endras and his number 1 plot the distance to the next target, whose coordinates would have been received in code and decoded on the unseen Enigma machine, the alarm bell sounds as all activities are abandoned and the whole crew is called to action stations. The electric motors are again turned on as U-46 crash dives. The submarine now makes for the area given by the coordinates where a convoy has been spotted. Endras surveys the horizon, the convoy is seen in the distance. A target is selected.
Der größte Dampfer wird aufs Korn genommen. Das Boot geht in Schussposition.
The torpedoes are now loaded.